Salve, citizens, and welcome back to Rome. Now, last time around, we saw Rome emerge as a fledgling republic on the Italian peninsula. And in this next section, we're going to see the fledgling republic as it begins to grow and expand into the mighty empire that we all know that it becomes. Now, this is something that takes place over a number of centuries, and there are a number of major important events that encompass this growth. And so, as a result, we're going to take this section and we're going to divide it up into not two parts, not three parts, but actually four parts. And this first part here will chronicle the early years of Rome's growth and expansion and their first steps into the world of becoming an empire. And so what will we look at specifically here with the essential questions? Well, we'll examine what factors allowed Rome to expand at first to control just the Italian peninsula, and what allowed them to even control the lands of the Italian peninsula. From there, we'll move forward and look at Rome's first major foreign wars, the Punic Wars that they fought against their greatest rival, the city-state of Carthage. We'll figure out why the Punic Wars began, and we'll also look at what the outcome was of the First Punic War. Additionally, we'll then move on to the Second Punic War, which is probably the most important out of all of them in terms of Rome's growth, and it also introduces us to one of the greatest military commanders, not just in all of ancient history, but perhaps in all of history in general, and that commander was a Carthaginian general by the name of Hannibal Barca. We'll look at why the Second Punic War began, of course, because that's what you do with wars. You look at why they started. We'll look at the major events of the wars, and then, of course, the ultimate outcome of the Second Punic War. That being said, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. Alright, so Rome establishes itself as a republic in 509 BC, but they are by no means out of the woods at that point. They are still surrounded by enemies. You have the not-so-friendly Greek colonies to the south of Italy, and you still have the Etruscans there in the north. The Romans just barely removed from gaining their independence from those guys. However, despite this, the Romans managed to conquer their enemies one by one. Subjugating the Greek colonies in the south, and even taking out the Etruscans in the north. By 264 BC, Rome was the master of the entire Italian peninsula. Now, how do they pull off something like this? Well, a lot of it has to do with Rome's chief method of foreign policy, which happens to be war. It was usually the thing that they turned to first and foremost, and you can only pull that off if you have the military to do it. Lucky for the Romans, they did, and Rome's success in war was due to the strength and organization of their army. Now, in the Roman military, every single male citizen had to serve when called upon. It was a citizen military, and as such, it was the duty of every citizen to be prepared to fight, to train, to prepare their family members. We're not talking about something like Sparta here, but it's still a very well-trained and dedicated populace prepared to fight when called upon. Now, early Roman armies utilized the old Greek phalanx tactics. But soon the Roman generals found these tactics to be too slow and too hard to maneuver for the tactics that they wanted to use. And so to correct this problem, what the generals did was they reorganized the Roman army. Instead of having just one big massive chunk of humanity, they broke it down into ever smaller and more mobile units. The first unit that they broke the army down into was something called the legion. A legion consisted of anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers, and legions were further subdivided into smaller groups called cohorts. The cohorts even divided further into smaller groups called centuries, and each of these groups had its own commanding officer. A century and a cohort were led by an officer called a centurion, and then of course a general was the commander of a legion. Now, each individual soldier was called a legionary. These guys are very dedicated. They are very highly trained. They are very well disciplined. They're the backbone of the Roman army. It is on these folks here that Roman victories and the Roman Empire were built. Now, let's say that you get conquered by the Romans. Unlike what was the norm of burning and sacking cities and enslaving populations, the Romans realized that there wasn't much to gain in doing that. Because if you enslave entire populations, who is there to pay taxes to you? there's nothing to gain from that. If you continue to sack cities and enslave populations, people aren't too keen to live under your control, and they're more likely to rebel. Well, what the Romans want is people who are willing to live peacefully and cooperate and live under Roman control. And so as a result, what the Romans did was they typically treated their conquered territories pretty well and with respect, especially in the Italian peninsula. If you were conquered by the Romans, the territories would be subject to Roman law, certainly, but generally the people in the cities were allowed to govern themselves. They were granted Roman citizenship. They were allowed to keep their rights. All that was expected of them was to follow Roman law, pay their taxes, and serve in the military when called upon. I mean, really, it's not that bad. And by creating this type of situation and this type of solution, Rome, by conquering all of Italy, was able to keep the Italian peninsula loyal to it, and this would serve and pay great dividends in the future. Now, at the same time as Rome is expanding to come and control the entirety of the Italian peninsula, there is another great power in the Mediterranean Sea region rising on its own. That other great power is Rome's great rival, the city of Carthage. Carthage is located in North Africa. And Rome is powerful, but Carthage is even more powerful. Carthage is the wealthiest city in the Mediterranean Sea region. The Carthaginians were great traders with a powerful navy. Their empire had expanded to cover much of North Africa, the islands of the Mediterranean, and now a tiny little part of Spain. And at this point, the Carthaginians were beginning to expand into Sicily as well. Now, Sicily is a very important place in the Mediterranean Sea due to its central geographic location. Sitting in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, Sicily is ideal for controlling trade moving from east to west and west to east across the Mediterranean Sea. So if you wish to control trade in the Mediterranean, you need to control Sicily. But that's not what it was all about for the Romans, because Carthage is Rome's biggest rival, and Sicily is Rome's backyard. And Rome simply could not allow their greatest rival to be so close to their very own borders. I mean, imagine this. Imagine if enemies of the United States, like, say, Iran or North Korea, began establishing military bases just south of the border in Mexico. We certainly wouldn't be comfortable with that. Neither were the Romans comfortable with allowing Carthage to establish a final foothold in Sicily. So Romans were becoming worried about Carthaginian expansion in Sicily, and they knew that it had to be stopped. The result, of course, was war. And the series of wars that would be fought between Rome and Carthage would be called the Punic Wars. Now, the First Punic War literally is fought about Sicily. Both Rome and Carthage wanted Sicily. And the First Punic War was fought entirely in Sicily. This war lasted for over 20 years, 264 to 241 BC. And initially, as the war starts, Rome, with a much more powerful army, appears to have the advantage. Rome was largely a land-based force at this time. And so they were able to win battles on land against the Carthaginians. However, Rome lacked any semblance of a navy. Because they'd always been a land-based army, they never really had a navy. So even though the Romans could win victories on land, those land victories were often negated by Carthage's victories at sea. The Romans could take cities, they could take territory, the Carthaginians could then blockade and harass the coastlines, and really they just didn't get anything out of it. And so this continued to be the case until the Romans ran into what was pretty much a stroke of dumb luck. That dumb luck was that a Carthaginian naval vessel ran aground in southern Italy. The Romans got a hold of the ship, they reverse engineered it to figure out how it was built, and then they used that model to start constructing their own fleet. And soon, the Romans constructed their own fleet that not only rivaled but surpassed the Carthaginian fleet. They quickly began to defeat the Carthaginian navy at sea and turn the tide of the war directly in their favor. And it would be a major Roman naval victory in 241 BC that would finally lead Carthage to surrender, bringing the First Punic War to an end. Now, for their victory, Rome received the island of Sicily, and Carthage was forced to pay huge war reparations. That is to say, they had to pay tons of money to Rome. So the First Punic War ends with Roman victory.